Hey everybody, Argent here. So this is a request I get a lot. Argent, do your top 10 favorite anime series, talk about waifus, that kind of thing. So I'm going to do my top 10 favorite anime series. This is probably going to take a really long time, like my top 10 favorite video games, but it is what it is, so I might as well get going. So before we get to the top 10, we're going to start with three honorable mentions. These are all kind of massive series, massive mainstream series. But I think I should mention them because whether you like them or not, they did a lot for anime as an art form, and they did a lot for it as in terms of getting it accepted into North America and places outside of Japan. The first one, I think, whenever you're talking about kind of the best or more significant anime series, is you have to talk about Naruto, which I think, other than maybe like Rama One Half or Yu Yu Hakusho, is the biggest, longest anime of all time. And there was a lot to like in Naruto. It had very innovative, I guess you could say, combat action scenes. There was a ton of characters, many of them very interesting. The overall plot line, even if it got a bit ridiculous, was a lot of fun. And the show did have a lot of heart. So, Naruto, even though I'd say it is certainly flawed in a lot of ways, it was a gateway drug for a lot of people. It got a lot of people into anime and it kind of made it mainstream. And the fact that it has such staying power, I think, speaks to the fact that there's something more to it than just being kind of a lame kid show. Second honorable mention is Gundam Wing. Now, if you grew up in the 90s, early 2000s, you might remember Gundam Wing. I think it was, at least in my recollection, the first Gundam series to really get broadcast on North American television. Gundam Wing was kind of something different for an animated series that a lot of us hadn't seen before. It was very serious, issues of life and death, of political ideology, of war and peace, of the fate of nations and empires, was dealt with extremely frankly and very in depth. While the show was very fascinating and entertaining to watch, at the same time it was also quite disturbing at times, and it really kind of took anime to us and animated stuff in general and showed that it could be an art form and it could say things about the world, about war and peace, about ideology, despite being ostensibly an art form primarily targeted for children. So I think Gundam Wing gets a lot of credit for that. It's not enough to make it into my top 10 though. Once again, probably one of the most influential animes of all time. Inuyasha changed the art style, combat, all sorts of things regarding all kinds of animes, and a lot of them kind of live in its shadow. As one of the big kind of syndicated animes that became very popular in North America, along with Bleach, Naruto, Pokemon, and Dragon Ball Z, it really was kind of like the big kind of Japanese mythological fantasy anime. I remember watching it a lot as a kid, always being happy to tune in, and it was just a really fun show. I liked the characters. I really liked how they handled combat, how they handled Japanese mythology. I mean, the show was way too long, that was true. But it was actually kind of a flavor of the week show I didn't really mind because they always had very creative demons to fight. Once again, it was kind of something that took ostensibly something for kids and kind of elevated it into more of an art film and kind of dealt with some more serious issues than a lot of the stuff that was on at the time. Now, this one might be a bit of a stretch, but I did love this show growing up as a kid. I don't recommend to ever watch Visions of Escaflowne while high or drunk, because you'll probably have a bad trip. Escaflowne was super stylish and had a very unique visual style. It's kind of hard to describe, but it was continually disturbing, weird, and fascinating. Watching it is like watching kind of like this. It's very hard to even describe what Visions of Escaflowne is or is about. Essentially, it takes place in Gaia, which is kind of a parallel world from Earth that was created by the thought machine of the ancient Atlanteans as an alternate homeworld for themselves. And Isaac Newton somehow transported himself there and created a machine that could control people's fate and could grant everyone's wishes. And there's mechs. and dragons. And that's kind of my attempt to talk about Escaflowne, but it's super esoteric. The theme of fate, destiny, free will, choice, history repeating itself, and that sort of thing are all very prevalent throughout it. It was definitely one of the first animes I watched that was kind of philosophical in more of a metaphysical sense. Gundam Wing was more metaphysical in, more kind of metaphysical in a political, ideological sense. But this one really started to kind of get at the nitty-gritty of what is reality and what is free will. So, while Escaflowne is definitely acquired taste and not for everyone, it does get in the number 10 spot on my favorite animes. The first Gainax entry on this countdown is number 9, Nadia's Secret Blue Water. Nadia's Secret Blue Water is a big sloppy love letter to Jules Verne and to the 19th century in general. I don't think I've seen anything that really kind of captures the spirit of adventure that was so prevalent in Victorian era literature, such as H. Rider Haggard, H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, all those people. The Victorian era was kind of noticeable for this, I guess they call it Orientalism today in the critical theory part, but just this idea of exploring these strange, unknown civilizations, magic, a belief in progress and science, that technology would create a better future. And kind of throughout Victorian literature, there's always this faith in humanity, this belief that technology can make the world better, and just this fascination with learning and discovering, and that the world is kind of this beautiful, wonderful place. And there's darkness in it, but there's also just so much that's interesting and that makes life worth living. And Nadia's Secret Blue Water has all that. It also has very likable characters. The main character, John, is kind of a nerd, but I think he's very relatable and likable to probably the target audience of this. But he doesn't come across as annoying. Nadia's kind of annoying, but there's kind of some deeper background to her. Captain Nemo is an interesting character. Kind of the whole take on 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, kind of mixing that with really advanced technology, with kind of some World War I and World War II themes. I think it really does a good job of kind of creating an anime version of basically every Jules Verne story thrown together, while also having good characters and a very solid romantic subplot between Nadia and John. I give Nadia Secret Blue Water, definitely check it out if you like anything from the Victorian era. Like I said, it's a big sloppy love letter, and aside from the filler hell, which you might want to skip, it's a solid anime, definitely would recommend it. The second Gainax entry under this list is His and Her Circumstances, also known as Kano, although I probably butchered that. This was the only series I ever actually bought the manga for, and I have a couple volumes of it left. But Kano is a high school romance, but it's kind of a high school romance that's a lot deeper. It is made by Ono, after all. Basically, Kano follows two characters, Yuki and Ashima, I think his name is. I probably butchered it or forgot it. But the two main characters both kind of suffer from having a inferiority complex in different ways. And as a result of that, they try their best to appear perfect. They spend all of their time grooming themselves, studying, working out, because they're entirely reliant upon external validation for their existence. Now, so it raises a lot of kind of interesting questions about personal identity. How much should you rely on what the outside versus the inside world? Should you seek validation from others, etc.? And kind of as the series goes on, the two characters fall in love pretty early on. They originally kind of fall in love with the idealized versions of each other that's presented to the world, but eventually they kind of both find themselves, and they realize that the truth is somewhere between the idealized versions of themselves and kind of a more base version of themselves. And they kind of truly fall in love for real. And kind of in between, there's a lot of people who want to break them up. There's a lot of, kind of interpersonal conflict, because Arima has really deep personal issues relating back to his family and his childhood. But overall, his and her circumstance is an excellent high school romance, lacking any of the stuff I hate, like love triangles or harem. That is really kind of interesting, and I think anybody who can kind of remember high school or can kind of remember growing up would really enjoy it. Once again, Ono made it. Ono is kind of hit or miss. He's made some really good stuff, and he made Gurren Lagann, which I despise. But yeah, so that's number 8 on the countdown. Definitely check it out. So that brings us to number 7, Ghost Hunt. Ghost Hunt was something I watched in university. Specifically, I was part of an anime club there, and we watched it a couple times, normally on Halloween. So Ghost Hunt is, well, as it suggests, it's about a team of paranormal investigators who deal with ghosts and demons and all kinds of other supernatural phenomenon. So it's kind of cool because they've gotten this crack team together. There's like a Shinto priestess, there's a Catholic priest, there's a Buddhist monk who's also in a rock band, there's a guy who knows Chinese folk magic, and there's a medium. So there's a bunch of just kind of people with different abilities who have gathered together and to take on cases. So it's a lot of fun. The main character, Mai, is very kind of relatable and is really kind of pleasant. She's an orphan who damages some of Ara, I forget what his name is. Naru. Yeah, Naru, the narcissist. She damages some of his equipment during a paranormal investigation and has to work for him to pay it off. Although it turns out later that the equipment was actually all insured, and he just did it to get her get free labor from her. But yeah, so Mai's an orphan girl who works with them, and she's the heart of the show. But it's just kind of all around excellent. All the characters are well developed and are a lot of fun to see them interacting with one another. The ghost investigations are consistently interesting. My favorite arc being the Bloodstained Labyrinth, which I found legitimately scary. And overall, it's just kind of a nice, refreshing, modern take on what can often be an overused... there's a lot of paranormal investigation shows and animes, but this one is definitely top-notch, and the good characters and good story really make it stand out. If you have any interest in ghosts or paranormal or just kind of slice of life, then Ghost Hunt I think is definitely one for you. So that's number 7. Let's move on to number 6. Number 6 is Dusk, Maiden of Amnesia. Now I literally just watched this one like 2 or 3 days ago, but I loved it so much I had to give it a decent spot on the list. So Dusk, Maiden of Amnesia is an anime about a girl named Yuko, who's a very cheerful ghost that lives on a high school premises. She died years and years ago. Eventually you realize it's quite a long time ago that she's been dead and remembers nothing about her previous life. Despite that, she seems pretty content and happy with being a ghost. So her biggest issue, though, is nobody can see her and nobody can touch her, so she's extremely lonely. However, she comes across a guy named Nia who can see her and can touch her. And over the course of the series, Nia decides to help her try to find her past and resolve what's keeping her from moving on. But they kind of fall in love with each other. And it's just kind of a very cute, sweet, and wholesome anime. There's a lot of fan service in it, which is kind of explained by the fact that Yuko hasn't been touched by another human in like a very long time. So she's always kind of cuddling with him and stuff like that. And Nia doesn't really try to take advantage of it, but he is 14 years old and he just kind of finds the whole thing awkward as he's kind of fighting between his hormones and trying to be a gentleman. But Dusk Maiden is kind of, I guess you could say, one of the best romance animes I've ever seen. It has a lot of good slice of life elements while also being supernatural. And it's just kind of a good character piece. There aren't a ton of characters, which I like. There's no harem, although multiple people are interested in Nia. He's not interested in them, which I like. There's no shitty love triangles. Well, I guess there kind of is, but it's like a one-sided love triangle. But overall, I really do like Dusk Maiden of Amnesia. If you like romantic anime, paranormal anime, slice of life, or just kind of want like a good Story, it's not too long. I think that's one of the good things about it. It's only 12 episodes. They didn't feel the need to just stretch it on indefinitely. The ending was pretty much perfect, and yeah. So I don't have a ton else to say. Just an overall great show. Highly recommend it. Now, before anybody says anything, I know this show has a lot of really creepy fans. Like, really creepy pedo fans. But, yeah, I'm not one of them. So Shauna, or Shauna of the Burning Eyes, is about a... It's kind of hard. That Shauna has a very deep mythology. Essentially, what happens is there are these beings called Crimson Denizens, and the Crimson Denizens will go and consume the spiritual energy of humans. And they'll replace it with a torch, which lasts a very short amount of time. And once the torch runs out, the person vanishes from existence. Not only dies, but completely vanishes from existence, and no one can even remember them anymore. So the Crimson Denizens basically go across the world devouring people. And there's a group of people called the Flame Hazes who have bonded with a god. In Shauna's case, Alistair, who's a giant phoenix. And they're sent by the gods to go and track down the Crimson Denizens and destroy them. And they're called Flame Hazes, and they're granted immortality and superhuman abilities in order to carry it out. I forget how old Shauna is, but she's been like 12, 13 years old or whatever for a long time. So she comes across Yuji, who's a boy that possesses the ability to regenerate his torch when he's about to die. So he kind of becomes something beyond just a torch, because he's basically, I guess you could say, immortal. It's all very complicated. Well, it's not super complicated. It's a fairly long series with a lot of. So as the series goes on, more and more Crimson Denizens show up, and obviously there's a big war that eventually breaks out. But a lot of the focus is on Yuji's and Shauna's relationship. Shauna kind of goes from being a cold, emotionless warrior into developing normal human feelings, and she and Yuji eventually fall in love. The series kind of goes on for quite a while, though, and I don't mean that in, like, most of what happens is necessary. It's not like Naruto or Bleach where there's a shit ton of filler that goes on and on and on. But eventually Shauna and Yuji come to opposite sides in the war. With, and I won't spoil it and go into too much detail, but their relationship is really cute. There's a lot of good action scenes. The whole kind of background and eventually some of the kind of the moral issues that are raised are interesting. Because initially it kind of seems very black and white, but as the series goes on, you kind of find out it's anything but. Shauna's just kind of an overall good magical girl anime, a good fantasy anime, and has a lot of slice of life elements if people like that. I highly recommend Shauna, and that's why it's number 5 on the list. Berserk is an anime that it's almost impossible to give a review of, just because it's just kind of a mess, but it's also awesome. The original Berserk anime is kind of a mixture of gross incompetence and extreme brilliance. Because on one hand, just the characters are great, the story is fascinating. There's kind of a lot of interesting motivations, there's a lot of kind of metaphysical issues explored. But at the same time, it's just really weird. The plot flow is often kind of uneven and strange. Mira, or whatever his name is, who writes it, is clearly insane. And if any you've seen the original anime, it ends on literally the most depressing note possible during the height of the eclipse, and nothing was ever made as a follow-up. So it's just this complete cliffhanger. It does have one of the biggest twists and the biggest reversals in all of anime history, and it's infamous for that. Like, I think it's up to, like, the first 3/4 of the series, it's following a pretty, like, normal standard path. And then once you reach the last couple episodes, everything just goes batshit crazy. And so there's Berserk, the original anime. Then there's the Berserk movies. There was 3 movies made a couple years ago that cover the events of the anime. And they look like shit because they're CG, but it's still Berserk, so they're still pretty good. They do some things better than the original anime, but overall the original anime is still better. And then there's the Berserk 2016, I think it is, the new Berserk anime, which is once again a mixed bag. Because on one end, we finally get to see what happens beyond the eclipse. They cover the Conviction arc. On the other hand, the Conviction arc is, in my opinion, not very good. And once again, it's the shitty CG. But on the other hand, it's Berserk, and you get to delve more into this fascinating, bizarre, but very creative world. Berserk is an anime like no other, and a franchise like no other. And that's kind of both a good or a bad thing. But for whatever its flaws are, I gotta give it credit for having some of the most interesting characters, one of the deepest and unique lores, and just kind of having a very unique aesthetic style compared to a lot of things. So Berserk, while riddled with a lot of issues, is also riddled with genius. And it's certainly worth a watch through if you're at all interested in fantasy or kind of any anime in general. It's kind of regarded as one of the gold standard animes that everybody has to at least give a try at some point. Number 3 is Code Geass. I know this one is kind of an obvious pick. It's a very kind of normie anime series, but that doesn't mean it isn't good. Now, the reason Code Geass is number 3 and not number 2 or number 1 is because I'm going to admit Code Geass has a lot of flaws. The series could have been a lot shorter. There's a ton of filler that is very tonally weird. They put in just a lot of fan service. They put in a lot of commentary and high school stuff. And some of that would have been okay, but it just kind of drags on and on and on and on. And it just gets really weird, especially once you get to the season 2 when things are just super dark. Code Geass, though, it does a lot of things better than most animes of its type. Kind of the politics of it, and in particular the geopolitics, are a lot better. Because I find the xenophobia of the Japanese, and I use that term unironically, just descriptively, the xenophobia of the Japanese often makes it seem that they really don't know much about the world beyond Japan, and they just kind of have really weird generalizations. It's kind of hard to describe, but just watch anything about the modern world and how they perceive places outside of Japan, and you'll get what I mean. It's just very strange. But Code Geass, I think, tends to understand that better. It tends to understand kind of the nature of international politics, the Game of Thrones, that sort of thing's a lot better than other animes. Once again, as with most good animes, you have a cast of great characters. Lelouch is kind of become one of the all-time greatest anime characters because he's kind of a villain protagonist. He's very sympathetic, but his methods, personality, and appearance are all very reminiscent of the villain in most animes. However, like I said, he is quite sympathetic. And then you kind of have an inversion because Suzaku is very similar to kind of the generic anime protagonist, but he's kind of one of the main villains in the series, at least in my opinion. But you have a host of other kind of interesting and good characters throughout the series, like Lloyd, the Earl of Pudding. Who else is there? Emperor Charles v. Britannia is also good. There's just a lot of stuff to love in Code Geass. The rating, I find, is pretty consistently good. The characters are likable. The voice acting's top-notch. They really kind of captured also how weapon development works, because throughout the series, the various nightmare classes, which are kind of like mechs, there's constantly an arms race with who can build the better ones. And whenever there's kind of a key breakthrough, it makes all existing nightmares obsolete, which is very much how main battle tanks worked during World War I and during the Cold War era, where an advance would render everything prior to it largely ineffective. But yeah, so Code Geass is overall great. Like I said, there's a ton of filler that should be removed. There's too much fan service, and there's this whole subplot with the thought elevator, which is two of the last episodes, which is complete bullshit and basically kind of changes the genre of the anime, and it's really weird. Probably the most enjoyable part is watching Lelouch's plans play out. He has absurdly complicated plans that are brilliant and really take advantage of the psychology of his opponents. He's kind of like an anime version, or he's kind of like a metrosexual version of Grand Admiral Thrawn. And that's pretty cool. Overall, I can recommend Code Geass, although once again, despite as much as I love this anime series, it does have a lot of flaws. It's kind of like Berserk in that regard. Number 2, Rozen Maiden. So yeah, Rozen Maiden is maybe not what you expected to be this high on the list, but it is something I just don't really have any complaints about. Okay, the ending, at least in Rozen Maiden 2, Part 2, Dreaming, was kind of bullshit. It didn't really explain anything, and it just didn't really make a lot of sense. But it's kind of hard to complain about much else other than that. Rozen Maiden is one of the most implicitly white things ever made. It's also one of the most wholesome things ever made. Basically, the premise of Rozen Maiden goes like this. You have a NEET who has autism, and I'm going with this even though it's not what they say in the show, whose parents recently died. So basically the main character, June, was like a super genius who got perfect scores in school and was the highest ranked student, and kind of a series of unfortunate events happened. His parents died, he did poorly on a couple tests, and he underwent a ton of bullying. Because of that, he's kind of gone into an autistic coma and spends his days in his room ordering stuff off of the internet and then returning it at the last minute, which is bizarre but is kind of hilarious. So yeah, so he has his autism powers. So one day he receives a package containing the most beautiful doll he's ever seen, and he winds her up to discover that the doll comes to life. And that's Shinku, the first Rozen Maiden we see in the series. So it turns out that there's 7, I guess 8, because there's the fake one, Rozen Maiden dolls. And they're all they all are based off of, like almost you could say, different archetypes. It's kind of hard to describe. But they're all living, and they all kind of have personalities of 13 to 14-year-old girls, or I guess 12 to 14-year-old girls, which is about the same age that June is. So they're living dolls, and they all kind of act like proper ladies, although proper ladies is kind of a stretch for some of them. So there's apparently this thing called the Alice game, because they were created by this German super Aryan guy named Rozen, who had the vision of the perfect girl Alice, and he kind of put parts of how he visioned Alice into all of the Rozen Maidens, and he bid them to fight one another, and whoever would win the Alice game would get to become human and become Alice. And so there's kind of a lot of different interesting kind of moral questions, because some of the dolls like Soisei Seki and Shinkun are against competing in the Alice game because they view each other as sisters, and they think maintaining that family tie is more important than becoming Alice. And then there's Soiginto, who's obsessed with father and will do anything to be able to meet him and to be able to become a real girl. So kind of the focus of the first season is the dolls helping June to kind of come out of his autistic coma and kind of regain his strength, regain his confidence, and to become a better person. And we kind of see all the dolls grow and change as the series progresses, as they kind of collectively get more mature and learn more about life. A great part of the series, though, is just spent with kind of slice of life, general cuteness. Rozen Maiden is a super wholesome series. There's not really any... I'd say there's like no sexual content in it. There's like one part where it's kind of played for jokes, where June catches the dolls in their underwear. Although their underwear are like long nightgowns that are more modest than like 90% of anime characters. But it's kind of played off as a joke, because he's kind of like just staring at it, because it's just really weird to see like moving dolls. And Shinku remarks, "Are my ball joints so attractive?" And yeah, so that's like the closest the series goes, and that was like not really anything, and it was just obviously a joke. But yeah, no, it's just a lot of the series is humor and just kind of cute stuff, because like Shinku acts really mature, but she's actually very childish in a lot of ways. Like, she's obsessed with this show called Detective Kun Kun, with this Sherlock Holmes-esque dog. And she'll watch it, and she believes that if she yells out that the bad guy's behind Kun Kun, that he'll turn around. But an example of like kind of some of the episodes you'll get, particularly in the less serious ones, is there's one episode where Soisei steals Hana Ichigo's strawberry and then makes it look like she's going to give her strawberry to Hana Ichigo so that she can look good and everyone will attack Hana. And this leads into a war where some of the dolls back June and Hana, and some of them back Soisei over who is actually the one who stole the strawberry. So, like, that's the whole episode, and they wind up building, like, forts on the stairs and trying to outmaneuver each other. But then there's also, like, extremely depressing stuff, like terminal illness, like mentally ill comas, abuse. It's just kind of a series that has a little bit of everything, but is overall just extremely wholesome, extremely adorable, and it's just a ton of fun to watch. I recommend Rozen Maiden for pretty much everybody. It's kind of funny. It's kind of like the Japanese My Little Pony in some ways. It's a show kind of about dolls that's aimed at older males, primarily. And some people kind of sexualize it, which is really disgusting. It's kind of more like, I don't know, they're just kind of cute girls. I mean, they're the kind of girl that you'd want as your daughter, and you just kind of want to hug them. But like I said, they don't really sexualize them at all in the show, and I appreciate that. But yeah, Rozen Maiden is excellent. I can't recommend the show highly enough. And so that's number 2. Let's head to number 1. Oh, come on. I'm sure everybody knew that this was going to be number 1. Now, before we go into it, I'm going to say Evangelion is probably the most flawed anime on this list. I mean, Nadia has the shitty island filler episodes. The first episode of Dusk Maiden is not very good in my opinion, and Bleach is kind of a clusterfuck in a lot of ways. And Code Geass has a lot of just unnecessary fan service, a bizarre subplot that shouldn't have been in it, and a lot of filler. But Evangelion has a lot more flaws. There's a lot of stuff that doesn't make sense. The timeline doesn't make sense. They introduce time travel later on, which makes the whole thing even more illogical and even more bizarre. Then they retcon the time travel, which is very confusing. They, like in the rebuild, they change people's names for no reason. And just a lot of things you really have to read between the lines on this one. Like, I think one of the things that I think a lot of people miss out on, and I know I missed out on, is that Asuka is hopelessly in love with Shinji. And it's just not very apparent, especially if you're younger watching this. But Eva really captured a generation of children growing up in the 90s and early 2000s. I think it'll continue to capture people's imaginations until the end of time. It really kind of speaks to the lack of identity, the lack of purpose, and kind of the confusion of the teenage years. Who are you? What do you want? Why are you here? Where are you going? Kind of the 4 questions from Babylon 5. Does the show really attempt to answer these? To a certain extent, but it's kind of more about the journey and more about the exploration. Particularly as the series goes on, the show moves more and more away from kind of the sci-fi action elements and more towards the characters' internal motivations, kind of their internal pathologies, and their attempts to kind of define themselves and find meaning before things become too late. So yeah, it's if you want to look up the plot of Evangelion, I'm not going to go into it just because it's available like everywhere, and it's some of the most complicated, convoluted nonsense ever. But what makes Evangelion truly great is that it was kind of one of the first animes, at least one of the first animes Westerners saw, that really tried to take it and elevate into an art film, an art form. Sorry, not an art film. Although Enta Eva kind of is an art film. It was trying to take something that was very much seen as only for children, seen as only something that was just there for pure entertainment, and make it say something about the human condition, make it say something about society, and make it a very profound product that aims extremely high. Does Eva always meet these in aiming high? No, in a lot of cases it utterly fails to meet the challenges of aiming really high in terms of its conception and how it's created. At the same time, though, Ava, I think to everybody, is one of the first animes they've watched and is often kind of the first really serious one that really makes them think. In particular, a lot of people, this really appeals to them when they're younger and they're going through maybe a period of depression, as it remains, to me at least, the most accurate portrayal of mental illness in fiction and what it's like to be mentally ill. To have depression, to have bipolar disorder, to have borderline personality disorder. It's very accurate in this regard. And it's kind of, to a certain extent, a deconstruction of all animes that came before or after it. You have Shinji and Asuka, who are both kind of different, and Rei, who are all kind of deconstructions of the Mary Sue or the anime protagonist. And there's a strong aspect, and this comes from who Guy Nix is, of giving the fans what they want, but doing it in the worst way possible. It's very much about inverting tropes and expectations. So, Neon Genesis Evangelion is my favorite anime of all time. Once again, I know it's a mess, and if people don't like Ava, I completely understand. It's not for everyone, and it's an acquired taste. So, like, if I was to talk about, like, shows on this list that I think have the fewest flaws, Rozen Maiden would probably be up there. Ghost Hunt doesn't really have flaws. Some of these just don't have a ton compared to Ava, but Ava is still excellent. I still highly recommend it, and I'll talk to you guys later.